When I received that text message at 2:47 a.m., "I'm hiding in your closet. They don't know I'm here. Please don't come home yet." My blood ran cold. The sender was Rosa, my cleaning lady of 3 years, and the fear in those words made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped my phone. I was supposed to be on a red-eye flight back from my sister's wedding in Seattle, but a mechanical delay had stranded me at the airport hotel. Whatever was happening in my penthouse apartment right now, Rosa was terrified, and I was 4 hours away from being able to help her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Diana Castellano, and until that night I thought I had my life figured out. At 38 years old, I'd built a successful career as a medical device patent attorney, working 70-hour weeks to afford my downtown Chicago penthouse with lake views that took my breath away every single morning. My late husband Marcus had left me comfortable when he passed from a sudden heart attack 2 years ago, but I'd never been the type to rest on anyone else's laurels. I worked because I loved the challenge, because staying busy kept the grief at manageable levels, because proving myself had always been my way of moving through the world. Rosa Delgado had come into my life through a referral from my colleague Patricia, who swore by her discretion and attention to detail. Rosa was a 46-year-old immigrant from Guatemala who worked 3 cleaning jobs to support her teenage daughter and elderly mother. She came to my apartment every Tuesday and Friday, arriving at 9 in the morning and leaving by 2 in the afternoon, transforming my living space from the chaos of my hectic life into something peaceful and ordered. We developed the kind of comfortable relationship that exists between people who respect each other's work and boundaries. She never pried into my personal life, and I never asked about hers beyond polite inquiries about her daughter's progress in school. But 6 months ago, something had shifted in my carefully ordered world. I'd started dating again, hesitantly at first, dipping my toes back into the dating pool after 2 years of widowhood. His name was Preston Whitmore, and he was everything that should have been right on paper. 42, a successful investment banker, charming in that polished way that comes from private schools and country club memberships. We'd met at a charity gala where he'd bid an outrageous amount on a dinner package I'd donated, then insisted on taking me out to claim his prize. The courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive restaurants, weekend getaways to his family's place in the Hamptons, and thoughtful gestures that made me feel seen for the first time since Marcus's death. Preston had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, like my thoughts and opinions mattered in a world that often dismissed women in my field as too aggressive or too emotional. He listened when I talked about my cases, asked insightful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in my work. For months into our relationship, Preston had suggested moving in together. It was practical, he'd argued. He was always at my place anyway, and his lease was coming up for renewal. Why pay for 2 spaces when we were building something real together? I'd hesitated, not because I didn't care for him, but because I'd always been cautious about big decisions. Marcus and I had dated for 3 years before getting married, and I'd learned the value of taking time to really know someone. But Preston had been persuasive, and lonely nights in a too-large apartment had made me more willing to take the leap than I might have been otherwise. He'd moved in 6 weeks ago, bringing with him expensive suits, a collection of vintage watches, and his younger brother Kyle, who was supposedly staying temporarily while he got back on his feet after a bad business deal. Kyle Whitmore was 34, and from the moment he'd arrived, I'd felt uneasy around him. Where Preston was polished and charming, Kyle was rough around the edges, with a way of looking at me that made my skin crawl. He made inappropriate comments disguised as jokes, helped himself to my belongings without asking, and had a habit of appearing in doorways when I thought I was alone. Preston always laughed off my concerns, saying Kyle was just going through a tough time and needed family support. Rosa had been the first to voice what I'd been feeling but couldn't quite articulate. 2 weeks after Kyle's arrival, she'd approached me hesitantly as I was leaving for work on a Friday morning. She'd asked if we could talk privately, and something in her expression had made me cancel my first meeting and sit down at my kitchen counter. She told me that Kyle made her uncomfortable, that he'd started showing up at the apartment on days when he knew I'd be at work, that he'd made comments about her body and suggested she might want to earn some extra money by being friendlier to him. She'd been professional and direct, but I could see the fear beneath her composure. She needed this job and she didn't want to cause problems, but she wanted me to know what was happening in my home when I wasn't there. I'd been furious and immediately confronted Preston that evening. He'd been dismissive at first, suggesting Rosa had misunderstood Kyle's sense of humor, that she was being oversensitive, that his brother would never do something like that. When I'd pressed harder, insisting that Rosa's comfort and safety in my home were non-negotiable, Preston had finally agreed to talk to Kyle. The conversation had apparently happened, because Kyle had been coldly polite to Rosa after that, barely acknowledging her presence when their paths crossed. But the atmosphere in my apartment had changed. Preston had become distant, spending more time at the office or out with Kyle, claiming they were working on a new business venture together. When I'd asked about it, he'd been vague, saying it was complicated and still in the early stages. Then came the night of my sister's wedding. I'd invited Preston to come with me to Seattle, but he declined, saying he had important meetings he couldn't reschedule. I'd been disappointed but understanding. Our relationship had already been strained since the incident with Rosa, and I thought maybe a few days apart would give us both space to reconsider where we were heading. The wedding had been beautiful, my sister radiant, and for a few hours I'd been able to set aside my worries and just be present for family. But the mechanical issue with my return flight had changed everything. I texted Preston to let him know about the delay, and he'd responded with a simple acknowledgement, no questions about when I'd be home or if I needed anything. Now, sitting in a sterile airport hotel room at 3 a.m, staring at Rosa's terrifying text message, I felt the bottom drop out of my carefully constructed life. I called her immediately, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, each failed attempt ratcheting up my panic. Finally, I texted back, my fingers trembling on the screen. Rosa, are you safe? What's happening? Should I call the police? 3 minutes passed with no response, each second stretching into an eternity. Then my phone buzzed. Don't call police yet. Need you to see something first. I'm recording everything. They're in your bedroom going through your things. Please trust me. My bedroom. Preston and Kyle were in my bedroom, going through my things, and Rosa was hiding in my closet witnessing whatever they were doing. The implications crashed over me like a wave. This wasn't some random break-in. This was something else entirely, something that involved the man I'd been sharing my bed with and the brother I'd reluctantly welcomed into my home. I immediately booked the earliest flight I could find, a 6 a.m. departure that would get me back to Chicago by 9:30. Then I texted Rosa back, telling her to stay hidden, to keep recording, and to leave the apartment the moment it was safe to do so. I promised her that whatever she'd witnessed, I would handle it, and that her job was secure regardless of what happened next. The next few hours were agony. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, could barely think beyond the racing worst-case scenarios playing out in my mind. What were Preston and Kyle looking for? What were they planning? And why had Rosa felt the need to hide in my closet rather than simply leaving when she discovered them there? At 4:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a video file from Rosa. The message accompanying it was brief. I'm home safe now. Watch this before you come back. I'm so sorry, Diana. My hand shook as I opened the video file. The footage was shaky at first, clearly filmed from inside my walk-in closet through a partially open door. I could hear voices before I could see anything, Preston's familiar tenor and Kyle's rougher baritone, both of them speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Then the camera angle shifted slightly, and I could see into my bedroom. Preston was kneeling by my nightstand, methodically going through the drawers, while Kyle stood watch by the door. What I heard next made my blood run cold. The life insurance policy has to be here somewhere, Preston was saying, his voice tight with frustration. She said she kept all the important documents in the apartment. Maybe she's got a safe deposit box, Kyle suggested, and I could hear the irritation in his voice. We've been through this place 3 times now. No, she's too sentimental for that, Preston replied, and the casual knowledge in his voice, the certainty with which he spoke about my habits, felt like a violation. She likes having things close. Check the office again. Look for anything about the Marcus Castellano estate. Kyle disappeared from frame and Preston stood up, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd seen 100 times when he was stressed. But this time, seeing it in this context, it looked different. Predatory. Calculated. 2.4 million, Preston muttered to himself. unaware that Rosa's phone was capturing every word. All of it sitting there. And she's so wrapped up in her bleeding heart lawyer routine that she doesn't even touch it. Waste of perfectly good money. The video continued for another 10 minutes, showing Preston and Kyle methodically searching my bedroom and home office, discussing my assets with the casual entitlement of people who'd already decided those assets belonged to them. They talked about insurance policies, investment accounts, the penthouse itself. They discussed timelines and opportunities, spoke about making it look accidental, about how a grieving widow who'd already lost one husband wouldn't seem suspicious losing another. They were planning to kill me. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making the hotel room spin around me. The man I'd been sleeping beside, the man I'd been considering a future with, was plotting my murder for my money. And his brother was his willing accomplice.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The video ended with Rosa's whispered voice, barely audible over the sound of my own thundering heartbeat in my ears. I came back from my phone. I left it charging in the kitchen. I heard them talking and hid. I'm leaving now through the service entrance. I'm so sorry, Diana. I'm so sorry. I sat in that hotel room as dawn broke over the Seattle skyline, watching the video 3 more times, catching details I'd missed in my initial shock. The casual way Preston handled my belongings, the intimate knowledge of where I kept things, the calculation in every movement. This hadn't been an impulsive decision. This had been planned, probably from the very beginning of our relationship. I thought about the charity gala where we'd met, how he'd seemed to know exactly which donation package to bid on, how he'd already known so much about my work and background. I thought about how quickly he'd suggested moving in, how convenient the timing had been with his lease renewal. I thought about Kyle's arrival, supposedly temporary, supposedly just bad luck with a business deal. It had all been orchestrated, every step designed to put Preston in position to access my assets. And Rosa, loyal Rosa who just needed to support her family, had stumbled into the middle of a murder plot and had the presence of mind to document it instead of fleeing in panic. She'd hidden in my closet, terrified, recording evidence that would save my life, because she trusted that I would do something with the information. As I boarded my flight back to Chicago, I wasn't the same woman who'd left 4 days earlier to celebrate her sister's wedding. That Diana had been uncertain, still grieving, willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. The Diana heading home now was clear-eyed and furious, armed with evidence and a plan that was taking shape with every mile that brought me closer to my apartment. I texted my colleague Patricia from the plane, asking her to meet me at my office at 10 a.m. for an urgent matter. Then I texted my lawyer, Richard Rosen, asking for an emergency consultation that afternoon. Finally, I texted Rosa, thanking her for her courage and promising her that she would be protected and compensated for what she'd done. I did not text Preston. The flight felt interminable, every minute stretching as I refined my plan. I couldn't simply go to the police with the video, not yet. Preston was a skilled investment banker, which meant he was intelligent and connected. He'd have explanations, lawyers, ways to spin the conversation into something innocent. 2 brothers discussing financial planning perhaps, concerned about their sister-in-law's asset management. Nothing explicitly criminal in the words themselves, even if the intent was clear to anyone actually listening. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to let Preston and Kyle believe they'd gotten away with their search, that I was none the wiser. I needed them to continue their plan, to take the next steps, while I documented everything and built an ironclad case. And I needed to protect Rosa, who'd put herself at risk to warn me. When my plane landed at O'Hare, I took a cab directly to my office instead of going home. Patricia was already waiting in the conference room, her expression concerned. I'd worked with Patricia for 5 years, and she was one of the few people I trusted completely. She was brilliant, ruthless when necessary, and fiercely loyal to the people she cared about. I showed her the video without preamble, watched her face shift from confusion to horror to cold fury as she absorbed what she was seeing. When it ended, she looked at me with eyes that had seen too many cases where men underestimated women to their own detriment. "We need to be very careful about this," she said carefully. "If we tip our hand too early, they'll disappear or claim it was all a misunderstanding. We need to catch them in an overt act. I know, I replied, and I heard the steel in my own voice. That's why I'm going home tonight as if nothing has happened. I'm going to act like the delay was just an inconvenience, like I'm just a tired woman coming home from a family wedding. Patricia leaned forward, her lawyer mind already working through scenarios. And if they try something tonight? Then we'll have officers stationed nearby ready to respond, I said. But I don't think they will. They're going to want to plan it carefully, make it look accidental. They'll need time to set it up properly. We spent the next 2 hours crafting a strategy. Patricia would serve as my point of contact, checking in with me at predetermined times. We'd involve the police, but carefully, bringing in a detective Patricia knew personally who could be trusted to handle the situation with discretion. Richard Rosen would help me immediately change all my financial access codes, update my will to explicitly exclude Preston and Kyle, and document every asset in a way that would make it impossible for them to claim any legitimate interest. By the time I left my office, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. More importantly, I had evidence, allies, and the element of surprise. Preston and Kyle thought they were hunting a naive widow. They had no idea they'd stumbled into the crosshairs of a woman who'd spent her career protecting intellectual property from people who tried to steal it. If they wanted to play games with my life and assets, they were about to learn that I played to win. I arrived home at 6 p.m., rolling my suitcase through the lobby with a practiced smile for the doorman. My heart was hammering in my chest, but my face remained calm, just another resident returning from a trip. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt like ascending to a stage, preparing for the performance of my life. Preston opened the door before I could even get my key out, pulling me into an embrace that made my skin crawl, even as I forced myself to return it. He smelled like expensive cologne and lies. "I'm so glad you're home," he said, and his voice sounded warm, concerned, everything a caring partner should be. "How was the wedding? You must be exhausted from all the delays." "It was beautiful," I replied, letting him take my suitcase and following him into the apartment that suddenly felt like enemy territory. Sarah looked absolutely stunning. And yes, the travel nightmare was frustrating, but I'm just glad to be home. Kyle emerged from the guest room, and I watched his eyes flicker over me with an assessment that now made perfect sense. He wasn't attracted to me. He was calculating my value, measuring me like an asset to be liquidated. "Hey Diana," he said casually. "Good trip." "Lovely, thanks," I replied, maintaining the pleasant facade while every instinct screamed at me to run. "How have you boys been managing without me?" "Just fine," Preston said, guiding me toward the couch. "Although the place definitely feels emptier when you're gone. Can I get you some wine? You look like you could use some relaxation." Every cell in my body rebelled at the idea of accepting a drink from him, but I couldn't show suspicion. "Not yet. Actually, I'm completely wiped out. I think I'm just going to order some takeout and crash early. You two have plans tonight." I watched Preston and Kyle exchange a quick glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Actually, we were thinking of heading out for drinks," Preston said smoothly. "Give you some quiet time to decompress. Unless you want company." "No, please go," I said, injecting relief into my voice. "I'd love some time to myself, honestly. These family events are exhausting." After they left an hour later, both dressed for a night out and smelling like they'd bathed in cologne, I immediately texted Patricia to confirm they were gone. Then I did something I've been planning since watching Rosa's video. I went to my closet, the same closet where Rosa had hidden, and I looked at it with new eyes. The space was large, a walk-in with custom shelving that held my professional wardrobe, shoes organized by style and color, accessories arranged with the precision I brought to every aspect of my life. But now I saw what Rosa must have seen. From a certain angle, wedged between my winter coats and the back wall, there was a space where someone could hide and see out through the partially open door into the bedroom. I thought about Rosa crouching there, terrified, holding her phone steady enough to capture clear video of Preston and Kyle plotting my death. The courage that must have taken, the quick thinking, the risk she'd accepted on my behalf. This woman who cleaned my apartment for $300 a week had done more to protect me than the man who claimed to love me. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Sarah Morrison, the officer Patricia had connected me with. She was parked 2 blocks away in an unmarked car, ready to respond if I needed her. We'd agreed that she wouldn't approach Preston and Kyle yet, that we'd wait for them to make their next move. But knowing she was there, that I wasn't completely alone in this, gave me comfort. I spent the next 2 hours carefully documenting everything in my apartment, taking photos of how Preston and Kyle had left things, noting what had been moved or searched. I checked every possible hiding place where I might have kept important documents, seeing the evidence of their systematic search now that I knew what to look for. Then I did something that felt both incredibly risky and absolutely necessary. I set up my own hidden cameras throughout the apartment, tiny devices I'd ordered online that afternoon and had delivered to my office. I placed them in the bedroom, the living room, the kitchen, and my office, angles that would capture any conversation or activity. If Preston and Kyle were going to continue plotting under my roof, I was going to have every word documented. Preston and Kyle returned around midnight, both slightly drunk and in good spirits. I pretended to be already asleep, listening through the wall as they moved around the living room, their voices carrying in the late-night quiet. She didn't suspect anything, Kyle was saying, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Came home like a lamb to slaughter. We need to move faster, Preston replied, his voice lower but still audible. The longer we wait, the more chance something goes wrong. I'm thinking 2 weeks. The lake house would be perfect. Accidental drowning. No one around for miles. My stomach turned over, but I forced myself to remain still, breathing evenly like someone deeply asleep. They were talking about killing me at my own lake house in Wisconsin, a property I'd inherited from Marcus and rarely used anymore. Remote, isolated, perfect for making a murder look like an accident. What about the cleaning lady? Kyle asked, and my breath caught in my throat. She's been acting weird, won't look me in the eye anymore. Rosa. Preston's laugh was dismissive. She's just an immigrant trying to keep her head down. She won't cause problems. Besides, she's only here when Diana's at work. She won't even know we're at the lake house. They had no idea that Rosa had already blown their entire plan wide open, that every word they were speaking was being recorded on the devices I'd hidden throughout the apartment. They thought they were so clever, so careful, when in reality they'd been caught from the very beginning. I lay in that bed in the dark, listening to them plan my death with the casual detachment of people discussing a business transaction. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. I was going to control the situation, dictate the terms, and ensure that when this was over, they would face every consequence their actions deserved. The next morning, I woke early and made breakfast like nothing was wrong, chatting pleasantly with Preston about my schedule for the week. I mentioned casually that I was thinking about taking a long weekend soon, maybe going up to the lake house to clear my head and get some work done in a quiet environment. I watched Preston's eyes light up with interest, saw the way he glanced at Kyle with barely concealed excitement. That sounds great, he said carefully. The lake house is beautiful this time of year. When were you thinking? Maybe next weekend? I suggested, pouring coffee with steady hands despite the fear coursing through my veins. I could use the break and I've got a brief due the following Monday. The quiet would help me focus. I could come with you, Preston offered, his voice warm with false concern. Keep you company, make sure you're safe out there alone. This was it. The moment where I had to commit to the most dangerous part of my plan. Actually, I said slowly, as if the thought was just occurring to me, I was hoping to have some alone time. No offense, but I need to think through some things. Work stuff. Life stuff. You understand, right? I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to position himself at the lake house without seeming too eager. Finally, he nodded, his smile understanding and supportive. Of course. You deserve some time to yourself. Just promise you'll be careful up there. Always am, I replied, meeting his eyes with a trust one absolutely did not feel. The rest of the week passed in a carefully choreographed dance of normalcy. I went to work, came home, had dinner with Preston and Kyle, played the role of the unsuspecting girlfriend while documenting every suspicious conversation, every whispered planning session they thought I couldn't hear. The cameras I'd hidden captured everything, building a case so solid that no lawyer in the world would be able to explain it away. Detective Morrison checked in daily, reviewing the footage I sent her, coordinating with the prosecutor's office to ensure we had everything we needed for arrests that would stick. She wanted to move sooner, concerned about the risk I was taking, But I convinced her to wait. We needed them to commit to an overt act, needed them to reveal the full scope of their plan. Rosa called me midweek, her voice trembling with worry. Diana, this is too dangerous. What if something goes wrong? What if they hurt you before the police can stop them? They won't, I assured her, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. I'm being careful and I have people watching my back. But Rosa, I need you to do something for me. I need you to not come to the apartment anymore this week. Tell Preston you're sick, that you can't work. I don't want you anywhere near this when it all comes down. She'd agreed reluctantly, and I'd immediately arranged for a week's pay to be deposited in her account, plus a substantial bonus for what she'd already done. When this was over, I was going to make sure Rosa never had to worry about money again. She'd saved my life, and I don't forget debts like that. Friday arrived with unseasonably warm weather, perfect conditions for a weekend at the lake. I packed a bag that morning while Preston watched from the bedroom doorway, making a show of including my laptop and legal files, really selling the story that I was going there to work. You sure you don't want company? Preston tried one more time, and I had to admire his persistence. He was good at this, at playing the concerned partner. If I hadn't seen Rosa's video, if I didn't know what he really was, I might have actually believed him. I'm sure, I said firmly, zipping my bag closed. I'll call you when I get there, okay? It's only 2 nights. I'll be back Sunday evening. What I didn't tell him was that I wouldn't be going to the lake house at all. That plan had already been communicated to Detective Morrison, who was currently coordinating with local Wisconsin police to set up surveillance around the property. If Preston and Kyle followed me there, as I suspected they would, they'd be walking straight into a trap. Instead, I'd be staying at a hotel downtown, safely surrounded by witnesses and security cameras, waiting for the moment when Preston and Kyle revealed their true intentions. It was risky, relying on them to take the bait, but everything about their behavior suggested they would. They'd been searching for the perfect opportunity for weeks now, and I just handed it to them on a silver platter. I left the apartment around noon, making a show of struggling with my bag, acting every inch the professional woman heading out for a working weekend. The doorman helped me load the car, making small talk about the weather and traffic conditions heading north. I played my part perfectly, complaining about the drive ahead while internally counting down the minutes until this nightmare would finally be over. My phone buzzed as I pulled away from the building. A text from Patricia. Detective Morrison confirms Preston's car left the garage 3 minutes after yours. They're following you. Stay en route until you hit the highway, then take the exit we discussed. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. They'd taken the bait. Preston and Kyle were following me, probably thinking they were being careful, that I had no idea they were there. They were planning to catch me at the lake house, isolated and alone, perfect victim for whatever accident they'd staged. Except I wasn't going to be there. And when they broke into what they thought was an empty lake house, they'd find police officers waiting instead. I followed Patricia's instructions exactly, taking the highway north like I was actually heading to Wisconsin, then exiting onto a side road that led to a mall parking garage where Detective Morrison was waiting. I parked next to her unmarked car and quickly transferred to her vehicle, leaving mine in the garage with a tracker attached so we could monitor if Preston tried anything with it. They're still heading north, Detective Morrison reported, showing me the GPS tracking on her laptop. Wisconsin State Patrol has units ready to move in once they enter the property. We're going to get them, Diana. We're going to get them dead to rights. We drove back to downtown Chicago in silence, the weight of what was happening settling over both of us. This wasn't just about catching Preston and Kyle anymore. It was about sending a message that women weren't easy targets, that plotting murder had consequences, that thinking someone was weak or naive because they trusted you was a fatal miscalculation. The hotel room Patricia had booked was comfortable and anonymous, high enough up that I could see the lake in the distance, the same lake that Preston had wanted to use as the setting for my death. I sat by the window as afternoon faded into evening, waiting for the call that would tell me it was over. It came at 8:47 p.m. We've got them. Detective Morrison's voice was triumphant in my ear. They broke into the lake house through a basement window, both of them wearing gloves. They tampered with the gas line to the water heater, clearly trying to stage an explosion or carbon monoxide poisoning. We have everything on video and they're both in custody. It's over, Diana. You're safe. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with anger at the betrayal, at how close I'd come to being just another statistic, another woman killed by someone who claimed to love her. If Rosa hadn't forgotten her phone that night, if she hadn't been brave enough to hide and record, if I hadn't been willing to believe her and act on that belief, I would have driven to that lake house. I would have trusted Preston enough to let my guard down. And I would have died there alone, while he and his brother collected my insurance money and lived off my assets. The story made national headlines by Monday morning. Prominent investment banker and his brother arrested for attempted murder, caught in an elaborate plot to kill his girlfriend for her inheritance. The tabloids loved it, splashing Preston's professional headshot next to my carefully chosen photo from a charity event, painting me as the wealthy widow who'd nearly fallen victim to a modern-day fortune hunter. But the truth was more complicated than the headlines suggested. Preston wasn't some obvious villain. He'd been charming, attentive, seemingly perfect. He'd made me believe I could love again after loss, that building a life with someone new was possible. That's what made the betrayal so devastating. It wasn't just that he'd planned to kill me. It was that every moment of our relationship had been a calculated lie, every gesture of affection a step in a long con. The trial was 6 months later, and I attended every day of it, sitting in the gallery with Rosa beside me, both of us witnesses to different parts of the same crime. Rosa testified about what she'd overheard and recorded, her voice steady despite her nervousness at being in court. I testified about the financial manipulation, the pattern of Preston's behavior that now made terrible sense in hindsight. The prosecution presented the video evidence, the recordings from my hidden cameras, the physical evidence from the lake house. They painted a picture of two men who'd carefully researched wealthy widows, who'd chosen me specifically because I seemed vulnerable and trusting, who'd spent months setting up the perfect murder. Preston's lawyer tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that his client had been trying to fix a gas leak at the lake house, that the recordings were taken out of context. But no jury in the world was buying it. Not after hearing Preston's voice on those recordings, casually discussing the best way to make my death look accidental. Not after seeing the methodical way they'd searched my apartment, looking for documents they could use to access my assets once I was gone. The verdict came back in less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, breaking and entering fraud. Preston and Kyle were both sentenced to 25 years to life, their appeals denied at every level. I sat in that courtroom and watched them being led away in handcuffs, and I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction that justice had been served. These men had tried to reduce me to a dollar amount, to an obstacle standing between them and wealth they hadn't earned. Instead, they discovered that the woman they targeted was smarter, more resilient, and far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. After the trial, I took Rosa to lunch at one of Chicago's finest restaurants, the kind of place she'd probably never been to before. We sat by the window overlooking the city, and I slid an envelope across the table to her. "What's this?" she asked, her English still accented but clear after years in the country. "It's a contract," I replied, "for a full-time position as my personal assistant. Salary commensurate with the responsibility, full benefits, and a signing bonus that should more than cover your daughter's college tuition." Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she opened the envelope and saw the numbers I'd written there. "Diana, I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's not nearly enough," I corrected her gently. "You saved my life, Rosa. You could have walked away when you realized what was happening. You could have decided it wasn't your problem, that getting involved was too risky. Instead, you hid in my closet and documented evidence that put 2 dangerous men in prison. That kind of courage and loyalty is priceless, and I want to make sure you're taken care of for the rest of your life." She cried then, really cried, and I held her hand across the table while well-dressed diners pretended not to notice. When she finally composed herself, she looked at me with a seriousness that reminded me why I trusted her in the first place. "I was so scared that night," she admitted. "When I heard them talking about killing you, about the insurance money, I thought about my daughter, about what would happen to her if I got caught. But then I thought about you, about how you'd always treated me with respect, like my work mattered. And I knew I couldn't let them hurt you. You're a hero," I told her simply. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Rosa's daughter graduated from Northwestern 3 years later with a degree in engineering, her tuition fully paid by a scholarship fund I'd established in her mother's name. Rosa herself proved to be an exceptional assistant, managing my schedule and household with the same attention to detail she brought to cleaning. More than that, she became a friend, someone I trusted implicitly because she'd proven herself when it mattered most. As for me, I eventually moved out of the penthouse. Too many ghosts, too many memories of Preston's lies contaminating spaces I'd once loved. I bought a smaller place in a different neighborhood, somewhere with better security and no associations with betrayal. I threw myself back into my work with renewed passion, finding purpose in protecting the intellectual property and innovations that genuinely changed lives. I dated occasionally but cautiously, always with a background check run by Patricia's private investigator, always with clear boundaries and slow progression. I learned that being smart about protection didn't make me cynical or closed off. It made me wise. People sometimes ask me if I regret trusting Preston, if I wish I'd seen the signs earlier or been more cautious from the start. The truth is more nuanced than that. I don't regret the person I was when I met him, someone still capable of hope and connection after loss. What I regret is that there are people in the world who see kindness as weakness, who view trust as an opportunity for exploitation. But I also learned something valuable from that experience. I learned that I was stronger than I'd known, more capable of protecting myself and others than I'd realized. I learned that sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you'd expect, that heroism looks like a cleaning lady hiding in a closet with a phone camera, documenting evidence while terrified for her own safety. And I learned that women, when we support each other, when we believe each other's warnings and act on each other's courage, are a force to be reckoned with. Rosa trusted me enough to tell me about Kyle's harassment, and I trusted her enough to act on her evidence. That mutual trust, that willingness to put ourselves at risk for each other, was what ultimately saved both of our lives. The text message that started it all. I'm hiding in your closet. They don't know I'm here. Please don't come home yet. Is saved on my phone, a reminder of how close I came to losing everything. But it's also a reminder of what I gained. The knowledge that I can protect myself, that I have people in my life worth protecting, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight for each other. Preston and Kyle sit in prison cells now, their carefully laid plans reduced to cautionary tales about hubris and underestimation. And I sit in my office, continuing the work I love, living the life they tried to steal, surrounded by people who've proven their loyalty in ways that matter. The mansion they tried to claim is long gone, sold to fund Rosa's scholarship program, and a nonprofit I started that provides legal services to women escaping dangerous relationships. The lake house where they plan to kill me has been donated to a retreat center for domestic violence survivors. I've taken what they meant for harm and transformed it into something that helps others, that creates safety and opportunity instead of fear and loss. That feels like the ultimate victory, the final proof that they failed not just to kill my body, but to diminish my spirit or make me less than I was before. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working on a difficult case, I think about that moment when I first read Rosa's text message. How my hands shook, how fear threatened to overwhelm clear thinking. And then I think about the woman I became after that moment, the choices I made, the strength I discovered. We all have closets where we hide when danger threatens. But the real question is what we do with what we witness from those hiding places. Do we stay silent out of fear? Do we walk away to protect ourselves? Or do we, like Rosa, find the courage to document the truth and trust that someone will act on it? Rosa chose courage. And because she did, we both survived to tell this story, to warn others, to prove that predators don't always win, that women aren't always victims, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon we have is the willingness to believe each other when we say something is wrong. That text message saved my life. But more than that, it changed it, transforming me from someone who'd lost her way in grief and loneliness into someone who knows exactly who she is and what she's capable of protecting. And that transformation, painful as it was to achieve, is worth more than any inheritance, any mansion, any asset Preston and Kyle ever could have stolen. Because they could have taken my money, my property, even my life. But they couldn't take my strength, my intelligence, or my determination to ensure that what happened to me serves as a warning to others. The story of the cleaning lady who hid in my closet isn't just about a crime prevented. It's about the power of women protecting women, about trust and courage, about refusing to be reduced to a victim in someone else's crime. And it's about understanding that sometimes the most important person in your life isn't the one sharing your bed or your home. Sometimes it's the one brave enough to hide in your closet and text you a warning at 2:47 in the morning, trusting that you'll be smart enough and strong enough to know what to do with it. Rosa gave me that gift, and I've spent every day since proving I was worthy of it. The months following the trial brought an unexpected flood of media attention that I hadn't anticipated or wanted. News outlets from across the country wanted interviews, podcast hosts reached out for deep dives into the story, and true crime documentaries competed for exclusive rights to tell the tale of the cleaning lady who saved her employer's life. I declined most of them, protective of both my privacy and Rosa's, wanting to move forward rather than constantly reliving the darkest period of my life. But one request caught my attention. A women's legal advocacy group invited me to speak at their annual conference about recognizing warning signs in relationships and the importance of believing women when they report harassment or suspicious behavior. They specifically wanted Rosa to join me on stage to tell her side of the story from her own perspective. I met with Rosa over coffee to discuss the opportunity, unsure if she'd be comfortable with such public exposure. She'd been intensely private throughout the entire ordeal, speaking only when legally required to do so, avoiding the cameras and reporters that occasionally still lurked outside my building or hers. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted, stirring sugar into her coffee with hands that had gained new steadiness over the past months. Her daughter Sophia sat beside her, now a confident 17-year-old who'd inherited her mother's quiet strength. "I'm not good at speaking in front of people. My English, it's not perfect." "Your English is fine," I assured her. "But more than that, your story matters. There are women out there right now who might be seeing signs in their own relationships, who might have cleaning ladies or housekeepers or nannies who are witnessing things they're afraid to report. If we can encourage even one person to speak up, or one employer to actually listen when someone does, isn't that worth the discomfort?" Sophia reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, you should do it. You're always telling me to be brave, to use my voice. This is your chance to show other women like us that we matter too, that our voices count." Watching Rosa's face as she absorbed her daughter's words, I saw the moment she made her decision. It wasn't about the speaking engagement or the attention. It was about being the kind of example Sophia needed, about proving that immigrant women who cleaned houses for a living had just as much right to be heard as the attorneys and executives whose homes they maintained. "Okay," Rosa said finally, lifting her chin with determination. "We'll do it together. But Diana, you have to promise me something. Promise that we tell the whole truth, not just the parts that make a good story. I want people to know how scared I was, how I almost didn't hide, how I almost just walked away because I thought it wasn't my business." "I promise," I agreed, understanding what she was asking for. "We'll tell them about the fear and the doubt, about all the moments when doing the right thing felt impossible. Because that's the real story, isn't it? Not that you were some fearless hero, but that you were terrified and did it anyway." The conference was held in a massive hotel ballroom in downtown Boston 3 months later. The room was filled with over 800 women, attorneys and advocates, survivors and supporters, all gathered to discuss legal protections and resources for women escaping dangerous situations. Rosa and I sat backstage, both of us nervous for different reasons, waiting for our introduction. "I threw up twice this morning," Rosa confessed with a shaky laugh. "Sophia had to talk me out of canceling our flight. I've been to the bathroom 4 times since we got here," I admitted. "And I argue cases in front of federal judges for a living. Something about this feels more intimidating." We were introduced by the conference organizer, a silver-haired attorney named Margaret Chun who'd spent 40 years fighting for women's rights in some of the most conservative courts in the country. She spoke about our story with a reverence that made me uncomfortable, painting us as examples of perfect courage when we both knew the truth was messier and more uncertain. Then we walked onto that stage and the applause was deafening. Rosa gripped my hand tightly as we took our seats, her eyes wide with something between fear and wonder at the sight of so many women on their feet, clapping not just for what we'd done but for what we represented. I spoke first, telling the story from my perspective. I described meeting Preston, the courtship that seemed too perfect in retrospect, the red flags I dismissed because I wanted so badly to believe that love and partnership were still possible after loss. I talked about Kyle's arrival and harassment, about my initial conversation with Rosa when she'd reported his behavior, about my confrontation with Preston that had led to temporary peace but underlying tension. Then I described the wedding weekend, the delayed flight, the text message that had changed everything. I showed the audience the actual text on a large screen behind us, those stark words that had terrified me in that airport hotel room. I played portions of the video Rosa had recorded, though we'd edited out some of the most explicit planning details to protect the ongoing appeals process. The room was silent except for occasional gasps as people absorbed what they were seeing and hearing. These were attorneys who dealt with domestic violence cases regularly, who thought they'd seen everything, but something about the calculated nature of Preston and Kyle's plot, the casual way they discussed my death as if it were a business transaction, seemed to shake even the most experienced advocates in the audience. When I finished my portion, I turned to Rosa and nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her accented English carrying clearly through the microphone. "I almost didn't stay that night," she said, and her voice was quiet but steady. "When I came back from my phone and heard voices in Diana's bedroom, my first thought was to leave quickly, before they knew I was there. It wasn't my business, I thought. I was just the cleaning lady. What happened between Diana and her boyfriend was not my concern." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces watching her. "But then I heard them say her name. Diana. And they were talking about insurance money, about making it look like an accident. And I remembered how Diana had believed me when I told her about Kyle, how she had protected me even though it caused problems in her relationship. I thought about my daughter, about what kind of example I wanted to set for her. Do we only protect people when it's easy? When it doesn't cost us anything?" Rosa's hands were shaking as she continued. "So I hid in the closet. I was so scared. My heart was beating so loud I was sure they would hear it. But I took out my phone and I recorded everything. Not because I was brave, but because I thought if something happened to Diana, at least there would be evidence. At least someone would know the truth." She described the agonizing minutes in that closet, listening to Preston and Kyle systematically search through my belongings, hearing them discuss timelines and methods with the detachment of people planning a vacation rather than a murder. She talked about the moment she'd finally been able to slip out through the service entrance, how she'd sat in her car shaking for 20 minutes before she'd been able to drive home. "I texted Diana because I didn't know what else to do," Rosa said, and I could hear the emotion creeping into her voice now. "I thought maybe she wouldn't believe me. Maybe she would think I was making it up, trying to cause trouble. We were not close friends. I was her employee. Why would she trust my word over the man she loved?" I felt tears prickling my own eyes as I listened to Rosa articulate the vulnerability she'd felt, the power imbalance that existed between us, even in our respectful working relationship. She'd risked not just her safety but her livelihood to warn me, with no guarantee that I would take her seriously. "But Diana did believe me," Rosa continued, her voice gaining strength. "She didn't make excuses for Preston, or tell me I misunderstood what I heard. She trusted me, and that trust saved both of our lives. Because if she had confronted him without a plan, if she had let him know that she knew, I think he would have acted sooner. He would have been desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Rosa looked directly at them, making eye contact with women in the front rows. "I am here today to tell you that your instincts matter," she said firmly. "If you see something wrong, if you hear something that scares you, if someone asks you to keep a secret that feels dangerous, you have a right to speak up. And if you are someone with power, someone with education or money or status, and someone without those things tries to tell you they're concerned, you have an obligation to listen. Not to dismiss them, not to make excuses, but to actually hear what they're saying." She turned to look at me then, and I saw the strength in her face that I'd always known was there but that she'd rarely had occasion to display so publicly. "Diana treated me with respect before any of this happened," Rosa said. "She paid me fairly, she asked about my daughter's schoolwork. She noticed when I was tired or stressed. That respect is why I felt safe telling her about Kyle's harassment. And that respect is why I trusted her with the video I recorded. If she had been someone who looked down on me, who saw me as just the help, I don't know if I would have taken the same risk." The implications of her words settled over the audience like a weight. How many crimes went unreported because domestic workers feared they wouldn't be believed? How many nannies and housekeepers and caregivers witnessed abuse or danger but stayed silent because they needed their jobs, because they were undocumented, because they'd learned that speaking up often led to being fired rather than protected. When Rosa finished speaking, the standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Women were crying openly, holding up their phones to record her words, and I saw in their faces a recognition of something profound. This wasn't just a story about a murder plot foiled. It was a story about whose voices we value, whose observations we trust, whose humanity we acknowledge. The question and answer session that followed was intense and emotional. Women asked about the legal process, about how to document suspicious behavior, about how to protect themselves while gathering evidence. Several asked Rosa specifically about overcoming fear, about finding the courage to act when every instinct screamed to stay silent and safe. One question came from a young woman in the back who identified herself as a domestic worker. "I clean houses for 5 different families," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Last week I saw bruises on one of the wives, and when I asked if she was okay, she said she fell down the stairs. But I've seen those kinds of bruises before. Should I say something? What if I'm wrong and I lose my job?" Rosa leaned forward into the microphone, her expression serious. "You trust your eyes," she said simply. "Bruises tell stories and stairs don't usually leave handprint marks. You don't have to accuse anyone or cause a confrontation, but you can leave information where she might find it. A phone number for a domestic violence hotline written on a piece of paper, left somewhere private where only she would see it. You can let her know carefully that if she ever needs help, you would support her. Sometimes just knowing that someone sees the truth, that you're not alone, that's enough to give a person courage to leave." She paused, then added, "And if you lose your job because you tried to help someone, then that was not a job worth keeping. I know that's easy for me to say now, after Diana helped me. But I truly believe that our dignity is worth more than any paycheck from people who would punish us for caring about someone's safety." I watched Rosa transform before my eyes during that conference. The nervous woman who'd thrown up that morning had been replaced by someone confident and clear. Someone who understood the power of her own story and wasn't afraid to use it. The immigrant cleaning lady who'd spent years trying to make herself invisible in the homes she cleaned was claiming space and demanding to be seen. After the formal presentation ended, we were surrounded by women wanting to talk, to share their own stories, to express gratitude for our willingness to be vulnerable in public. We stayed for over 2 hours, long past the scheduled end time, because how could we walk away when people needed to be heard? One woman, a partner at a prestigious law firm, told us about her housekeeper who tried to warn her that her teenage son was struggling with drug addiction. The woman had dismissed the concerns, defensive and insulted that the help would presume to comment on her family. It wasn't until her son overdosed and nearly died that she'd realized the housekeeper had been right, had been trying to save him, and had been punished for caring. "I never apologized to her," the attorney said, tears streaming down her face. "She quit after the overdose, probably because she couldn't stand working for someone who'd ignored her warning. I don't even know where she is now, but I think about her all the time. I think about how my pride and my assumptions about who deserved to have an opinion almost cost me my son." Another woman shared that she was a housekeeper who'd witnessed her employer's husband installing cameras in their teenage daughter's bedroom. She'd reported it to the mother, who'd fired her on the spot for making disgusting accusations. 6 months later, the police had arrested the father for child exploitation, and hundreds of inappropriate videos were found on his computer. "I see that girl's face in my nightmares," the woman said quietly. All those months she was being recorded being violated, because her mother wouldn't believe that her perfect husband could do something like that. "I tried to save her and I got punished for it." Story after story, women bearing witness to the ways that power and class and assumptions about whose observations mattered had led to preventable harm. Rosa listened to each one with fierce attention, holding hands and offering tissues, validating every person who'd been dismissed or punished for trying to protect someone. On the flight back to Chicago, we were both exhausted but energized in a way that felt almost electric. Something had shifted during that conference, some understanding that our story was bigger than just the two of us, that it represented a systemic problem that needed systemic solutions. "We should do something," Rosa said suddenly, looking out the airplane window at clouds illuminated by sunset. "Not just talks at conferences. Something real, Something that helps people like those women we met today. What are you thinking? I asked, curious about where her mind was going. She turned to face me, her expression thoughtful. A program maybe. Something that teaches domestic workers their rights, that gives them resources if they witness crimes or abuse. And something that teaches employers how to create environments where their workers feel safe reporting concerns. Training for both sides, so everyone understands that protecting each other is everyone's responsibility. I felt excitement building as she spoke, my legal mind already working through how such a program might be structured. We could partner with domestic worker advocacy groups, I said slowly, thinking out loud. Provide legal consultations for workers who've witnessed crimes, help them understand what they're obligated to report, and what they're protected from reporting. Create a hotline they can call anonymously to get advice. And for employers, Rosa added, warming to the idea, workshops about recognizing signs of coercion or abuse, about building trust with the people who work in their homes. Classes about why someone might hesitate to report something they've seen, and how to make it safer for them to speak up. We spent the rest of the flight sketching out ideas on napkins and the backs of boarding passes, our previous exhaustion forgotten in the rush of possibility. By the time we landed in Chicago, we had the rough outline of what would become the Witness Protection Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering domestic workers and creating accountability structures for employers. The name was Rosa's idea, a deliberate play on the legal concept of witness protection. Because that's what we're doing, she explained. Protecting the witnesses who see things in private homes, giving them tools and support so they can report safely, and protecting the people they witness crimes against, by making sure those reports are taken seriously. Over the next 6 months, we built the program from the ground up. I leveraged my legal connections to recruit volunteer attorneys who would provide free consultations to domestic workers. Rosa connected with immigrant advocacy groups and domestic worker unions to spread the word about our services. We created a multilingual hotline staffed by trained counselors who understood both the legal complexities and the cultural barriers that often prevented reporting. The response was overwhelming. Within the first month, we received over 300 calls from domestic workers who'd witnessed everything from elder abuse to financial exploitation to child neglect. Some were seeking advice about whether they were legally required to report what they'd seen. Others wanted to report, but were terrified of losing their jobs or facing retaliation. A few were undocumented and feared that reporting crimes would lead to their own deportation. Each case was different, but common threads emerged. Fear was universal. The power imbalance between employer and employee created situations where witnesses felt trapped between moral obligation and economic survival. And perhaps most troubling, many domestic workers reported having tried to raise concerns in the past, only to be dismissed, fired, or accused of lying. One case that stayed with me involved a nanny named Patricia who called our hotline in tears. She'd been caring for twin infants whose mother was clearly suffering from severe postpartum depression. Patricia had witnessed the mother shaking one of the babies during a particularly difficult crying episode, had seen bruises appearing on the infant that couldn't be explained by normal baby clumsiness. Patricia had tried to gently suggest to the father that his wife might need help, that she seemed overwhelmed and perhaps should see a doctor. The father had exploded at her, accused her of trying to undermine his family, and threatened to report her to immigration authorities if she ever made such vicious accusations again. Patricia was undocumented, supporting 3 children back in El Salvador, and absolutely terrified. Our team worked with her to document everything she'd witnessed, connected her with an immigration attorney who helped her apply for a U visa available to crime witnesses, and coordinated with Child Protective Services to launch an investigation that ultimately saved those babies from serious harm. The mother was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis and got the treatment she desperately needed. The father issued a public apology to Patricia and helped sponsor her permanent residency application. But not every case ended so well. We heard from housekeepers who'd been deported after reporting employer crimes, nannies who'd been blacklisted in their communities for speaking up about abuse, caregivers who'd lost everything for trying to protect someone else. Each story reinforced why the work mattered, why Rosa and I pushed through exhaustion and frustration to keep building something that might prevent even one person from facing the impossible choice between silence and survival. The employer workshops were initially harder to fill. Wealthy people don't generally like being told they need training on how to treat their employees, especially employees they consider just housekeepers or nannies. But slowly, as word spread about what we were teaching, attendance grew. We didn't shame or lecture. Instead, we shared real stories, including our own, about what happens when communication breaks down, when power dynamics aren't acknowledged, when people who work in private spaces aren't empowered to speak about what they witness. We taught practical strategies for building trust, creating clear reporting pathways, and ensuring that domestic workers understood their rights and protections. One workshop participant, a hedge fund manager named Robert, approached me during a break with visible discomfort on his face. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Our family has a live-in caregiver for my elderly mother. A few months ago, she tried to tell my wife that she thought my brother was stealing from my mother's bank account. My wife fired her on the spot for making accusations against family." He paused, clearly struggling with what he needed to say next. "Last week, we discovered that my brother had indeed been stealing from our mother. He'd emptied nearly $200,000 from her accounts. The caregiver was right, and we punished her for trying to protect my mother. I don't know how to fix that, but I wanted you to know that your program matters. If we'd gone through this training before, maybe we would have listened instead of firing her." I helped Robert track down the former caregiver and facilitate a conversation where he could apologize and offer compensation for the wrongful termination. She accepted both with grace but told him something I made sure to share at every subsequent workshop. "The money helps, but what hurt most was not being believed. I cared for your mother like she was my own family. When I saw someone stealing from her, I had to speak up. Being punished for that made me feel like I didn't matter, like my years of service meant nothing." That sentiment, that fundamental need to be believed and valued, echoed through every interaction we had with domestic workers. They weren't asking for special treatment or dramatic changes. They just wanted to be seen as full human beings whose observations and concerns deserved consideration. The Witness Protection Initiative grew beyond anything Rosa or I had initially imagined. Within 2 years, we'd expanded to 6 cities, trained over 5,000 domestic workers in their rights and reporting procedures, and provided legal assistance in more than 200 cases of witnessed crimes. We'd also trained nearly 3,000 employers in creating safer, more transparent working environments. But the work that felt most meaningful happened in the small moments. The nanny who called to say she'd successfully reported child abuse, and the family had thanked her instead of firing her. The housekeeper who'd witnessed elder abuse and felt empowered to contact adult protective services. The caregiver who'd noticed signs of domestic violence and knew exactly what resources to provide to the victim. Each of these small victories represented someone who'd been believed, whose courage had been validated, whose humanity had been acknowledged. And each represented a potential tragedy prevented, because someone had the tools and support to act on what they witnessed. Rosa became the public face of the organization, traveling to speak at conferences and universities, sharing our story with anyone who would listen. She was featured in magazines and news programs, always using her platform to amplify the voices of other domestic workers whose courage had gone unrecognized. Her daughter Sophia was accepted to Northwestern on a full scholarship, planning to study social work with a focus on immigrant rights. Watching Sophia graduate high school and prepare for college, I saw the tangible impact of everything Rosa had risked that night in my closet. Not just my life saved, but her daughter's future transformed, and countless other lives protected by the work we'd built together. As for me, I'd found a purpose that went beyond my legal career. I still practiced patent law, still argued cases and protected innovations, but the work with the Witness Protection Initiative gave me something deeper. A sense that I was honoring both the woman I'd been before Preston's betrayal and the stronger, clearer-eyed woman I'd become after. The penthouse sold for just above asking price to a young tech entrepreneur who had no idea about its dark history. I used part of the proceeds to buy Rosa a modest house in a safe neighborhood with good schools, despite her protest that I'd already done too much for her. The rest went into an endowment for the Witness Protection Initiative, ensuring it would continue even if I couldn't actively run it forever. I dated occasionally but cautiously, always with background checks and slow progression, always with clear boundaries about access to my finances and information. I'd learned that love didn't require blind trust, that healthy relationships could include verification and protection. Some people found my approach cynical. I found it realistic. Preston's appeals continued to be denied, each court upholding the original verdict and sentence. I didn't attend the hearings anymore, didn't need to see him in his prison jumpsuit to confirm that justice had been served. He was where he belonged, and I was free to build a life defined by what I'd survived rather than what had been done to me. Kyle served his sentence in a different facility, and according to reports from the prosecution team, the brothers had turned on each other almost immediately. Each claimed the other had been the mastermind, that they'd been coerced or manipulated into participation. The transcripts of their accusations against each other would have been funny if they hadn't been planning my murder. 3 years after that terrifying text message, I sat in the living room of my new apartment, smaller and cozier than the penthouse had ever been, surrounded by photos that told the story of my real life. Rosa and Sophia at Sophia's high school graduation. The team from the Witness Protection Initiative at our second annual fundraiser. Me and Patricia laughing at some conference after party, both of us a little drunk on wine and success. And there, in a place of honor on the mantel, was a framed screenshot of that original text message. I'm hiding in your closet. They don't know I'm here. Please don't come home yet. People who visited often asked why I kept it displayed, why I'd want such a traumatic reminder in my daily life. But I didn't see it as trauma. I saw it as the moment when everything changed, when courage and trust intersected to save not just one life, but potentially hundreds through the work it had inspired. That text message represented the best of humanity. Someone scared but acting anyway. Someone powerless in traditional terms wielding the only power they had, the power of witnessing and reporting truth. Someone trusting that their warning would be received and believed despite every structural reason to doubt that outcome. Rosa and I had dinner every Sunday now, a standing tradition that had evolved from those early coffee meetings into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Sophia often joined us, bright and passionate about the work she wanted to do helping immigrant families navigate complex legal and social systems. Did you ever think that night would lead to all this? Sophia asked one evening, gesturing around my apartment at the evidence of the organization we'd built, the lives we'd impacted. Rosa and I looked at each other, sharing one of those wordless communications that came from having been through something profound together. That night I was just trying to survive, Rosa said honestly. I wasn't thinking about changing systems or building programs. I was thinking about Diana, about my daughter, about doing the right thing even though I was terrified. And I was just trying not to die, I added with dark humor that no longer felt quite so dark. But sometimes the most important work grows out of the worst moments. We take what tried to destroy us and transform it into something that protects others. Sophia nodded thoughtfully, processing this philosophy that would undoubtedly guide her own future work. So courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing it anyway. Exactly, Rosa confirmed, reaching over to squeeze her daughter's hand. And about trusting that your voice matters, even when the world tells you it doesn't. I thought about all the voices we'd helped amplify through the Witness Protection Initiative. The housekeepers and nannies and caregivers who'd finally been heard, whose observations had led to interventions and protections and sometimes prosecutions. The employers who'd learned to listen differently, to value the perspective of people who saw their private lives from angles they couldn't see themselves. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished, because power imbalances in silence and fear were endemic to human systems. But we'd created something that made a difference, that provided alternatives to silence, that proved witnesses could be protected and believed and valued. And it had all started with a text message sent in terror from a closet, and another woman brave enough to believe it and act. That seemed like a pretty good legacy, the kind that Marcus would have been proud of, the kind that honored both who I'd been and who I'd become. Not perfect but real. Not fearless but courageous anyway. Not without scars, but using those scars to light the way for others. Rosa raised her wine glass in a toast, and Sophia and I joined her. To closets, Rosa said with a slight smile. To hiding places that become turning points, I added. To women who save each other, Sophia finished. We clinked glasses and drank. 3 women connected by trauma transformed into purpose, by fear channeled into action, by the simple but revolutionary act of believing each other when we said something was wrong. The text message might have started the story, but this right here, this friendship and purpose and determination to keep building protections for others, this was how the story continued. Not with an ending, but with ongoing work, with daily choices to honor what we'd survived by helping others survive too. And somewhere, in homes across the country, domestic workers were bearing witness to things their employers didn't see. Some would stay silent, trapped by fear or need or uncertainty. But some, because of the work we'd done, would know they had options. Would know their observations mattered. Would know that speaking up didn't have to mean losing everything. That knowledge, that possibility, that small but significant shift in who got to be believed and protected, that was what we'd built from the ashes of Preston's plot. And it was worth every difficult moment, every public appearance, every time we had to relive our own fear to give others courage. Because the alternative, staying silent and safe, letting the systems that enable harm continue unchallenged, that wasn't really safety at all. It was just complicity dressed up as self-preservation. Rosa had taught me that lesson that night in my closet. And together we were teaching it to anyone willing to learn. One workshop at a time. One hotline call at a time. One woman choosing courage over comfort at a time. The work continued, and so did we, bearing witness to each other's strength and using it to light the way forward. 5 years after that night, I stood in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel, accepting an award for the Witness Protection Initiative's impact on domestic worker rights. Rosa stood beside me, no longer nervous about public speaking, her presence commanding and sure. The organization had expanded to 15 cities, helped over 1,000 workers report crimes safely, and trained more than 10,000 employers in creating accountable households. But the number that mattered most to me was different. 43 lives saved. That's how many people were still alive because a domestic worker had witnessed danger and knew how to report it safely. 43 children protected from abuse. 43 elderly people rescued from exploitation. 43 women who didn't become statistics because someone saw and spoke. Sophia was in the audience, now a graduate student studying social policy, already making waves with her research on immigrant worker protections. She'd grown up watching her mother transform from invisible housekeeper to celebrated advocate, and that transformation had shaped everything about who she was becoming. As I looked out at the crowd, I saw faces that represented our journey. Detective Morrison, retired now but still volunteering with our legal team. Patricia, who'd left her corporate practice to work full-time on employment law for vulnerable workers. Margaret Chun, the silver-haired attorney who'd first invited us to speak, beaming with pride at what we'd built. And in the back, sitting quietly but visibly present, was the hedge fund manager Robert, the man who'd fired his mother's caregiver for reporting theft. He'd become one of our biggest donors and most vocal advocates, using his story to convince other wealthy employers that listening to domestic workers wasn't charity but wisdom. In my acceptance speech, I told the truth about that night. Not the sanitized version we sometimes offered for public consumption, but the real story. How terrified Rosa had been. How close I'd come to dismissing her concerns about Kyle. How many moments of doubt and fear we'd both experienced before courage won out. We weren't heroes, I said, looking directly at Rosa. We were just two women who decided that protecting each other mattered more than protecting our comfort. And that decision, that single choice to trust each other in a moment of crisis, created ripples that are still spreading. Every worker who calls our hotline, every employer who takes our training, every life saved because someone knew reporting was possible. That's all built on the foundation of one woman hiding in a closet and another woman believing her. The standing ovation lasted so long I lost count of the minutes. But what mattered wasn't the applause. It was the text messages that started coming in before we'd even left the stage. Domestic workers sharing their own stories of witnessing and reporting. Employers committing to better practices. Advocates reaching out to partner with us in new cities. The work would continue long after Rosa and I were gone. We'd built something that transcended our personal story, that existed now as a permanent challenge to systems that had always silenced witnesses in private spaces. We'd proven that believing women, especially women with less power, wasn't naive kindness but strategic necessity. That night, back in my apartment, I looked at that framed text message one more time. The words that had terrified me 5 years ago now represented hope. Proof that courage existed even in the most frightening moments. Evidence that women protecting women could literally change the world, one witness crime, one believed report, one protected life at a time. Rosa called as I was getting ready for bed. "Did you see the donor numbers?" she asked, excitement clear in her voice. Tonight's event raised enough to expand to 10 more cities. "I saw," I replied, smiling at her continued amazement at what we'd built. "We're going to need to hire more staff." "Good," she said firmly. "More women who understand what it means to be invisible, to see things others miss, to know that speaking up is dangerous but silence is worse. Women who've been where I was, hiding and scared but determined to do the right thing anyway." We talked for a few more minutes about logistics and strategy, but mostly we talked about how far we'd come from that terrifying night when everything had changed. How trauma had been transformed into purpose, fear into determination, victimhood into agency. After we hung up, I walked to my window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere in this city, and in 14 others where our program operated, domestic workers were going about their jobs. Most would witness nothing more dramatic than ordinary family life. But some would see things that needed reporting, would face the choice between silence and risk. And because of what Rosa and I had built, because of one night when she'd hidden in my closet and I'd believed her warning, those workers would have options, would have support, would have proof that their voices mattered and their observations deserved to be heard. That was legacy worth building. That was courage worth celebrating. That was the real ending to a story that had started with a text message and become a movement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.